This is Jason Spangler with Scouting Hot Finds Radio. I'm here with my guest tonight, Rick Stewart, who many of you will recognize from his articles in the ISCA Journal regarding scouting museums. Rick, thanks for coming on the air with us.
Glad to be here, Jason. It was good to see you at the South Carolina Traderee.
Yeah, Rick, we've been talking about doing this interview for a long time, so I'm glad that we reconnected at that Traderee and scheduled a date, and you've been certainly flexible with me in trying to get this done. So thanks very much for that.
No problem.
Well, we'll launch right into it since we've got some people listening. My first question, Rick, is tell us a little bit about yourself and your scouting background, because even though many of us have read your articles, we may not really know what your background is.
Well, I joined Cub Scouting back in 1962, and 57 years later, I'm still at it. Earned my Eagle just a week before I turned 18. Probably not an unfamiliar story. Have been active as a volunteer, spent 24 years as a professional. I'm a retired professional scouter. And probably the areas that I've enjoyed most are camps and scouting history.
And so what do you collect, or what is kind of what got you with the collecting bug going?
I was an accumulator for 20 or 30 years. At the 1993 Jamboree, I was on staff, and a gentleman who was a big CSP collector kind of got a hold of me and showed me the light, so to speak. When I went to that Jamboree, I had 83 CSPs in my collection, and today I'm somewhere north of 11,000. So he planted a seed. I also collect camp patches, OA from the lodges I've been in, and one OA flap from every current lodge, and a lot of different site collections.
Well, a lot of people can trace their origin stories back to a Jamboree, getting the patch bug. What got you on to scouting museums? How did that become a passion of yours?
I've always had an interest in history, and kind of casually, whenever I ran across a scouting museum, would stop at one. What really got me into it is about 4 years ago, I was on Patch L, and somebody posted a question: does anybody have a list of scouting museums? Well, I was intrigued. I said, that's a great question. So I did a little research, and I found 4 or 5 different lists. And then I tend to be kind of a detailed person, and I compared those lists, and none of them were really complete. So I compiled the list, added 2 or 3 that I knew of, and kind of got the word out through Patchell and other sources that I was putting this list together, and people kept feeding me information, and I've been adding to it ever since. So that's kind of how I got started. And then my good friends Bob Sherman and Dave Eby, who were both frequent writers for the ISCA Journal, kind of started suggesting that it'd be great if I started writing articles on museums. And I started about 4 years ago. I think my first article appeared in the June 2016 ISCA Journal, and I've been doing it every quarter since then.
Here's a question that we didn't talk about in our pre-call. When you think of scouting museums and you're putting together this list, give us an idea of just, run the gamut. I imagine that there are, museums in people's basements. There's museums in council offices. There's museums in, standalone buildings, maybe somebody's old farmhouse or something. Can you kind of describe to us that gamut of scouting museums that you've discovered and visited, that kind of thing?
I've seen, some real simple ones. I used to, in somebody's basement or in their garage that they pull out for camporees and different events, to some very sophisticated museums. There's some council-run museums out there that almost rival the National Scouting Museum. Some people have really gotten carried away with their private museums. Wilbur Williamson down in Bloomington added 2 huge additions to his house. So he kind of got it out of the basement and garage and had about 1,500 square feet of display space in his house. There's museums in trailers that get hauled around, to different events and don't have a permanent home. There are museums that are kind of an add-on to county museums and other public museums. There's about 40 different museums at scout camps, which I guess we would expect, and quite a few museums and scout offices too. So they kind of run from real simple to pretty sophisticated. Does that kind of answer the question?
What do you kind of consider a scouting museum in terms of, a display of just simply patches versus one that has more history and a theme? Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we've discussed this in the past. You let me know of a couple at camp and you weren't quite sure they were a museum. Some people think they have to be a 401c3, not-for-profit, or owned by the council with a staff and regular hours. But I've if it's more than a few displays, the other question I ask is, does it tell a story? Do they tell the scouting story and not just have a bunch of mugs and patches stuck in a case? Does it help preserve scouting history? I kind of look to see if there's a theme of some sort, whether it's on their local camp and council and OA lodge. And, the real big one for me is it worth going to see?
Rick, how do you decide which museums that you're going to see and write about for your ISCA journals?
Some of it's word of mouth when I hear that there's a really good museum. My wife and I do a lot of traveling, so some of it's kind of convenience. If we're going in a certain direction, like a few years ago we were up in New England, so I took that opportunity to stop in at the museum at Camp Carpenter in New Hampshire. We were in Las Vegas, so I made hit that. So we kind of combine it with other trips, either personal vacations or my wife is in 2 or 3 different organizations that have conventions. So I'm real good at tagging onto the conventions and going visiting national parks and scouting museums.
And of the museums that you visited, do you have any favorites, ones that you really want to sort of brag about and share?
Well, yeah. Probably my favorite would be the Camp Mayaconda Museum that Dave Eby's put together in Toledo, Ohio. Before people go, oh, what? That shouldn't be your favorite. I grew up in that camp, was a camper back in the 60s, was a camp director back in the 90s, was there when the council was going to tear the building that the museum's down, and the OA Lodge kind of stepped in and saved it. So I've seen it grow from a beat-up old building to a really, really nice museum. So that would be one of my favorites. Central States Museum in Larned, Kansas, which many of you probably remember, had that tragic fire about 4 years ago. It was run by a great old gentleman by the name of Charles Sherman. He was 80-some years old, lost his museum, he was living above it, lost his home, and his response was, by gum, I'm gonna rebuild it. And I kind of adopted and stepped in to see where it could help him. Did a couple articles on that museum.
Yeah, so I actually remember that fire, reading about it in your journal article, and I remember actually sending in a donation, and I got a patch back. I think it was from Ryan Meador. It was a burned patch from North Carolina that was in the museum, and I still have that. That was a cool keepsake. Yeah,
they lost all but 5 or 10% of their collection, and much of what they were able to save was no longer museum quality. But they found a new building, found some funding for it, rebuilt it in an old gas station / convenience store, made great use of. They saved the beverage cooler at the end that we all go and get our Coke or iced tea out of. They used that as a display. Already had the lighting. They made a real good use of it. But Charles Sherman, who was the driving force behind that, passed away about a year ago, and the museum's just not going to survive.
Well, we'll come back to that one. I did want to ask you, in talking about museums, which states seem to have the most museums? Where are the hot spots?
New York is probably the one with the most. I think they've got 10 or 12. California's got quite a few. Illinois has several. North Carolina seems to be in it. It's got some really good museums. New Mexico's got that whole group of museums at Philmont, so that kind of skews it. Texas has got 8. So those are kind of the big ones, and there's probably 6 or 8 states that, like Montana and North Dakota and Utah, that to my knowledge, don't have a scouting museum.
All right, Rick, so let's say you're aware that in the summertime I'm out on Lake Murray in South Carolina as a camp director, and that camp has a lot of collectors, but there's no museum at the camp, there's no museum at the council office, there's no history committee that's formalized, none of that exists. So tell me, having interviewed all these people and visited these museums, how would somebody go about kind of starting from scratch with a goal of getting a museum at their camp in, 3, 4, 5 years? What would that game plan look like?
Well, one way to start is last June there was the first ever National Scouting Historian Summit at Philmont. There were 167 people in that class, and that was a topic of several of the sessions was how to start a council museum. I would encourage, if you send people to NOAC, I think there's probably going to be some sessions on how to start a council museum. I would probably spend some time in GO, is that what they call it now? Just talking to Jeff Morley and some of the others that are running it. If you're in North Carolina, you have several excellent museums, and I can give you some contacts. Rick Horn at Cherokee Scout Reservation, Ken Badgett is down there, the Hammerstone Museum. So you've got a lot of museums in the area that I'm sure. One thing I found is people love to talk about their museums, and they love to help people get started.
Would you say that the successful museums, and maybe this is not fair to judge, but is it better to have a council, bylaws type thing where the council sort of has control over this concept, or do you see it being more successful when it's just the real serious private collectors, come together and try to initiate something?
I've seen both be highly successful, and I've seen both struggle. You have to have a core group that's going to be passionate about it, and organize it, because it's real easy for things that are gathered at camp to disappear. As we both know, they can walk out the door, and you wonder where that great old patch went. And unfortunately, it may be in somebody's private collection. So, my advice would be, find some people. I've got a list with 140 different museums on it that I'm always willing to share. Is get a hold of that list and call a few of the museums that might be in your area and ask questions. Maybe go visit the museum at Raven Knob or Cherokee Scout Reservation and see what they've got to put together, and talk with their curators.
I can just tell you the sad story from my own camp growing up is there was a building that was built in the late 80s, and in that building they designated probably what you would describe as a walk-in closet. That was a little disappointing, but anyways, a walk-in closet to be the museum. And an older gentleman donated a bunch of stuff, some pretty nice old camp patches. And at some point over the next couple of years, a couple of the key patches walked, and that kind of just took all the air out of the museum idea. I mean, no one else was willing to donate anything. There was a lot of fingers pointed back and forth about who was suspected of swiping it, whatever. So yeah, there's things like that can really sort of take all the passion and the air out of the room when you're talking about museums.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you that situation was unique, but I've heard it again and again. And until you get formalized, and an inventory is vital, so that you know what you have. A proper environment, because you and I both know that the physical environment at most scout camps isn't necessarily the best environment to keep fragile old artifacts in. You've got mice and moisture and rain and cold and a lot of other factors that come in. So getting it into a secure environment is important.
Can you speak also to the mixture of things that are on loan, where someone has a nice frame of stuff and they're just loaning it, versus someone gifting it, or a museum taking donations? What are kind of the pitfalls or the benefits of any of those?
The most successful museums that I've seen have got documentation. So if you've got this stuff, they're going to have one or two pieces of paper in front of you saying, Jason, please sign here that you're donating to the museum, or it's on loan, and here's the terms of the loan. So put it in writing so that there's no mistake, because I have heard stories where, that scouter may have intended to give it away, but they pass away, and then their families come back and say, hey, where's Granddad's collection of first issue OA flaps? We want it back. So unless you have it in writing, you've got that danger.
And what's the best advice for handling donations? Like, I can imagine that in a council museum or a camp museum, you would get kind of bombarded with a bunch of donations where they're not really museum worthy. Is it pretty standard practice for these museums to sell them off? And is that tricky, or is that not that hard because you're a nonprofit and you can just, talk about that? That would seem like a little bit of a tripwire or a landmine for some of these museum types. Again,
you need to put that in writing too. If the family saying, hey, if we can't use this because we've got 7 other examples of this particular patch, is it okay if we sell it or trade it to acquire new items for the museum? And just put that in writing and put that up front as well. What
about, in you're writing your ISCA journals, where are you kind of going with that? 4 years in, do you still just have lots of museums to visit, or what are your plans for that going forward?
I still have lots of museums. I've been, every once in a while, mixing in an article that's not about a museum. Like I wrote an article on the Scouting Historian Summit at Philmont. I'm kind of a side collection that I've started since I dived into the museums is I have a museum patch collection, so that might possibly be an article in the future. Just some thoughts, and I'm not sure. I haven't really put a lot of thought into this. An article on how to protect items, maybe to get some people to give some advice on how to insure and protect your collection in case, like in Kansas, you would have that unthinkable fire. Unfortunately, in that case, the building was insured and the items weren't. So, and I'm always open for suggestions. A few weeks ago, a good friend of mine called and said, Rick, I got a great idea for you for your article. And I'm, okay, great. I'm always open to new ideas. I think you should write an article on the 10 best scouting museums in the United States. And I said, I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm not going to go there. And my friend said, well, why not? I said, well, tell me, if I didn't list your museum on my 10 best list, what would your reaction be? Why, I'd never talk to you again. Exactly. But I'm always open for ideas.
You've mentioned several times the National Historian Summit that was held at the Philmont. Can you just maybe go into a little more detail there and talk about what some of the highlights were? And then also, what is the follow-up on that? Is there another one planned? Is there something planned at NOAC to reinforce that or build on that effort?
Again, Jeff Morley and some of the others who gave leadership to that, Bill Topkis, when I asked them that at the conference, I said, we need a couple of months just to catch our breath and get regrouped. I would think that you won't see another conference like that for several years, but you will see offerings at NOAC, and some other things like that.
What were your takeaways? I mean, you've been kind of on the front lines of this whole, museum
Well,
thing.
I had a great time. There were 4 different tracks. There was one, if you were telling the story, if you were running a local museum, there was that track. If you were into writing, there was a track for that. There was a track for technology. So you could really kind of tailor your experience to to your interests and your needs. And they had some absolutely fabulous presenters. If we listed them, everybody would know who they were.
So have you ever entertained the idea of putting stuff in a museum or starting your own museum?
I recently became the chairman of the Three Fires Council History Committee. While we don't have a museum, we do have a beautiful new dining hall at Camp Big Timber in Elgin, Illinois. And the Scout Executive has asked the committee to put 6 or 8 different shadow boxes together, each kind of focusing on a different aspect of scouting and council history and camp history. Part of that, he wants to control what goes up on the walls, rather than just have people start tacking up patrol flags or different things, as we've all seen. So, yeah, I'm getting involved on that level. I'm hoping to maybe work with the museum at NOAC. I've applied, haven't heard back. On the way home from the summit, my wife was with me. She loves to go to Philmont. While I'm in class, she plays, goes hiking and horseback riding and all the other neat activities there. I spent a week at Ben Delator Scout Ranch in Colorado. They use a series of volunteer museum hosts. So I spent a week there, basically as a docent. So I'm getting more and more into it.
When you mentioned the Scout Executive and his motives for having the museum committee, the history committee, it reminded me that I've often heard in scouting that professional scouts are really not that interested in preserving council history, museums, displays, patches, whatever. Can you kind of touch on that as far as, is that sort of how you've seen it too, or maybe not?
Professionals are scouters just like volunteers. They come in all different shapes, sizes, and interests. Some are very interested. Mike Serbaugh, the most recent Chief Scout Executive, was actually on the founding committee for the Bill Helcourt Museum at Camp Woodland in New York. So he certainly had a successful career, and he obviously had an interest in museums and preserving scouting history. So I don't think we can make a universal statement. We can't make a statement that volunteer scouters aren't interested in financial stability, only professionals are. Some professionals are, some aren't. I spent 24 years as a professional, and I'm pretty passionate about it. So,
well, speaking of Mike Serbaugh, one of the big things that happened in the last couple of years is the National Scouting Museum moving out to Philmont. Have you been there, and can you kind of tell people, what was that like and what's going on out there?
I have. I've actually been fortunate in that I've been able to visit the National Museum in all 4 locations, New Jersey, Kentucky, Texas, and the new one at Philmont. I actually was there in October of last year, of the year before, when they had the grand opening, and was able to spend some time with the director and the curator and wrote an article on that. I think they've done a fine job. I've seen all 4. In my personal opinion, and let me stress that, my personal opinion is this is the best effort so far. It's professionally done. They've got some great stuff, and it's not restricted just to scouting. Why there's half the museum certainly is scouting, and the OA has put a great display of some of their archives into the building. They also have a focus on Native American and Southwest United States history. They have the Seton collection. You're probably aware he was a fabulous artist. So they have a lot of his sketches and paintings. So it's a well done effort. So if you get out to Philmont, go see it. And I've heard some people, with different opinions that didn't meet their expectations. If you're expecting a building just stuffed full of old patches and old mugs, you might be disappointed. There's some of that, but there's so much more.
Well, and probably if someone really wanted to see that, they could go to some of the other museums on your list. Wouldn't you say some of the museums are just full of patches? I mean, maybe the Las Vegas Museum I could think of has, panels and panels and patches all everywhere, right?
If you want to see OA patches, go to the Las Vegas International Scouting Museum. They've got them. They also have. That's one of the museums I visited. They have an excellent international scouting room. They have a room devoted just to Baden-Powell memorabilia and history. Again, one of those museums that's real well done, but they've got some resources that probably most local council museums don't. So.
Well, Rick, in wrapping things up, let me just ask you a couple more questions, maybe some that I haven't prepped you for already. But, in thinking of Scouting Heritage Merit Badge, it has a requirement about trying to preserve the history of your own troop. And I'm just wondering, do you have any examples you've seen of troops doing a very good job of keeping their history, and what does that look like?
On my list, there's actually probably 2 or 3 museums that are troop, are troop museums. They put it together. They found a place to put their museum together, and so some troops have done an excellent job with that. Some do. The other half is a museum should have not, in my opinion, not just memorabilia, but it should have records and papers and and help preserve that history of the council. So if somebody asks, who was the council president in 1920, or who was the first Eagle Scout? They ought to be able to find that in the museum, I think. My next article will be on the museum at Raven Knob in North Carolina. And one thing they've done that's kind of unique is they have an agreement with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so that the university is actually preserving a lot of their paper records for them. And the university's got the resources. They've digitized those records so you can go on the university's website, and be able to look up old council records. Just a great way to preserve it, in my opinion. And one thing, when I did the article on the National Museum, one thing is, in addition to the museum, there's also the Seton Memorial Library there, which is just a treasure trove of books and other printed materials. And I think they mentioned to me that over 100 PhD candidates have used that library in doing the research needed to earn their PhD. That's pretty impressive, in my opinion.
Well, let me wrap things up by trying to ask you one question that hopefully is not too controversial, but I think it's out there. What do you say is kind of the balance between your hardcore collectors that are maybe a little more ruthless in getting things that they want versus someone who's more of a museum-type collector or someone with different ambitions? Do you see the difference there?
I think the museum-type person is somewhere along that path gotten more interested in the history of scouting and preserving it than in necessarily having the patches. Several museums that I know of, whoever founded the museum or who's running it right now, their personal collection often form the basis for starting that museum. Kind of to answer your question, follow the Scout Oath and the Scout Law, and we won't have many problems.
Well, I confess it was a loaded question, Rick, because in my experience, in my area where I grew up, we have an individual or two that have kind of hoarded all of the historical information and have talked to a lot of people, but they have what you might sort of say like ownership over those people. And
Yep.
if anyone else goes back and talks to those people or gets a patch from one of those people or whatever, then it's like you've just, committed a crime, and they'll judge you for life. So I just have come across people who, if they had a different outlook, would be able to put together a great museum, would share lots of information, but everything they have, they jealously guard because they don't want anybody else to have it or know it. And I've just always been very frustrated. So I have not had, in my area, growing up, I've not had good situations with people who, pretend to be Scout historians, but really are maybe more of a hoarder type mentality. So I don't know if you've run across those people, or this is just something where the water that so different strokes or something.
Well, I covered that a little bit in my first article, which was just kind of an overview of some of the research I'd done and what I thought constituted museums. Is before you donate or put on loan, get it in writing and ask questions, so that you aren't surprised, because it'd be very easy for me to walk up and talk to a widow and say, hey, how would you like to donate, Bill's stuff to the Rick Stewart Museum, which happens to be in my garage. Let the buyer beware. Ask questions and do your homework. There's no replacement for doing your homework.
Here's one scenario I've heard discussed and I've never followed up on. Let's say you have a really great collection, and I think there were some guys doing this in Virginia, and I've really lost track of what they did, but there were some guys in Virginia that had some resources, and I think they created a nonprofit, and maybe I wasn't sure if they were trying to use it as a way to leverage and, to a tax advantage maybe with their tax-advantaged way to add things to their collection, or I don't know. Just have you seen people kind of, I'm not saying abuse that situation of like having a quote-unquote museum, but I don't know. Just be there are some what I would call private museums out there that have incorporated themselves and are a legitimate 501c3 not-for-profit corporation. Which is a good way to put things in writing, but I guess isn't a guarantee. I've mentioned a couple of times the museum at Raven Knob Scout Reservation in Old Hickory Council. Most museums, they start the museum and then they slowly begin to accumulate stuff. In that particular case, the museum was started because many years ago, an old veteran scouter with a huge collection passed away, and his wife donated his large collection that included a lot of the paperwork that we were talking about and records to the council. And the council's response was the professional staff and the volunteers got together and they created a historical association, drew up bylaws and kind of formalized everything. So in that case, a donation actually started the museum. Rick, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. I know you've been very patient, really almost a whole year. We've talked about doing this interview, and I think getting you on tonight has been really good. Do you have any closing comments, or we think we've covered most of the high points?
No. I still maintain my museum list, so, read the article in ISCA. My email and everything is in there. Just shoot me a line, and I'll be glad. I'm always glad to share the list. Just don't ask me to name my 10 best museums.
All right. I will not put that in the show notes. No top 10 list. Well, Rick, thank you very much again for coming on, and we'll get this put out there for everyone to see. You can find this episode at scoutpatchcollectors.com. In the header there's a link for podcasts. Click on that, and you'll find it. Also, this podcast can be downloaded in iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, just about all those podcast apps you can get Scouting Hot Finds Radio. Rick, once again, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, this is the first podcast that I've done in 11 months. So you will be the phoenix. You'll be what allowed me to reborn this project.
I'm glad to be of service, and I've enjoyed this, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks, probably at the Indianapolis Trader 8.
I'll be there.
And I will be too, so.